My father's new wife thought she could humiliate me in front of an entire Michelin star restaurant for being broke. She laughed at my handmade gift, not knowing the paper she just shoved back in my face was the paid-off mortgage to the mansion she lived in. I stayed completely silent, letting her dig her own financial grave until the waiter brought the check. My name is Natalie, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and treated you like a burden. Is this supposed to be a joke, Natalie? Sylvia sneered, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls of the private dining room at Jean-Georges. The crystal chandelier above us caught the light of the massive diamond on her finger as she violently pushed my plain white envelope across the crisp linen tablecloth. It slid past the polished silverware and stopped right in front of my water glass. I looked from the envelope up to Sylvia. She was 41, dressed in a custom silk gown that probably cost more than most people make in a year, and her face was contorted in sheer disgust. Today was my father's 62nd birthday, and I had come to celebrate. I really thought that by 34 you would have outgrown arts and crafts. Sylvia continued, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that made the waiter standing in the corner shift uncomfortably. I mean, look at this. You brought a handmade card to a dinner that costs $1,000 a plate. Could you really not afford to stop at Tiffany or even a decent department store on your way here? I know you just push papers around at some boring accounting job, but surely you can put away a few dollars for your own father. I did not flinch. I just looked at the envelope. Inside was a certificate proving I had secretly paid off the massive secret debt she had forged against my father's house. But I did not say a word. I just let her talk. Richard, you really need to speak to your daughter, Sylvia said, turning her attention to my father, who was swirling his expensive red wine. She is embarrassing us. What if someone we know sees her handing you construction paper like a toddler? It reflects poorly on my brand. As the chief executive officer of a luxury aesthetics clinic, I have an image to maintain. I cannot have my stepdaughter looking like she belongs in a soup kitchen. My father, Richard, let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look at me with love or even basic paternal care. He looked at me the way you look at a stain on a new rug. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned forward, his expression hardening. Your mother is right, Natalie, he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. I asked you to make an effort tonight. I asked you to dress appropriately and act like you belong in our world. Instead, you show up in a plain suit, handing me a piece of paper. You are 34 years old. When are you going to get a real career and stop embarrassing the family image? I slowly picked up the envelope and tucked it into my leather bag. I am sorry the gift does not meet your standards, Richard, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. I will be sure to keep it to myself. Oh, do not act like a victim, Sylvia snapped, taking a dramatic sip of her champagne. You have always been jealous of what we have. Just because you failed to make anything of your life does not mean you get to drag us down. The waitstaff pretended to be invisible, pouring water with robotic precision. I just kept my face entirely deadpan. The thing about my family is that they mistake silence for weakness. They assume that because I do not scream or throw expensive wine glasses, I am a pushover. They saw a woman in a modest blazer who drove a practical car and lived a quiet life. They did not see the senior partner of the most ruthless private equity firm on Wall Street sitting right in front of them. They did not know that the quiet accountant they were humiliating was actually holding the strings to their entire financial existence. I slowly folded my hands together and offered Sylvia a polite smile. You are absolutely right, Sylvia, I said softly. I should be much more mindful of financial realities. Please continue enjoying your evening while you still can. Sylvia scoffed, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. She turned her attention back to her expensive champagne, dismissing me completely. That was when Jamal decided it was his turn to take a swing at the easy target. Jamal is my brother-in-law, married to my 28-year-old half-sister, Madeline. He is a 32-year-old corporate lawyer who never misses an opportunity to remind everyone in the room that he passed the New York bar exam on his first try. He shifted in his leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored Tom Ford suit. As an African-American man who had climbed the ruthless corporate ladder of Manhattan with aggressive ambition, he commanded respect in his professional field. But at family dinners, he simply used his booming courtroom voice to bully anyone he deemed beneath his tax bracket, which tonight meant me. "Listen," Natalie Jamal said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. He flashed a brilliant smile that was entirely devoid of actual warmth. "I know it can be incredibly tough out there for people without a clear career trajectory. You are pushing mid-30s now. That entry-level accounting stuff you do is not going to pay the rent forever, especially in this economy." I kept my eyes locked on his, my expression perfectly unreadable. "Is that right, Jamal?" I asked simply. "Yes, it is," he continued, his tone dripping with heavy, suffocating condescension. "In fact, I was talking to the managing partner at my firm just last week. We are currently expanding our records department. It is mostly basic data entry, filing paperwork, maybe scanning some legal documents. It pays minimum wage, maybe a little above, if you show some actual initiative, but it comes with a dental plan. If you want, I can put in a good word for you. It would finally give you a chance to afford a decent lifestyle instead of always scraping by on the margins." A sharp, high-pitched giggle broke through the tension in the room. It was Madeline. My younger half-sister sat next to Jamal, looking like she had just stepped off a Fashion Week runway. She was the undeniable golden child of the family, the one who received brand new imported cars for her birthdays while I was told to take the city bus. "Oh my gosh, Jamal, that is so incredibly generous of you," Madeline beamed, placing her perfectly manicured hand over his wrist. "You really should take the job, Nat. I mean, it is not like you have anything better going on with your life. Plus, it would be really nice to see you buy your own clothes for once. Do you remember when we were kids and Mom made you wear my old winter coats because they still had some life left in them? You looked so funny walking around in jackets that were 2 seasons out of style." She laughed again, and Sylvia quickly joined in, the two of them sharing a look of bonded superiority. Even my father chuckled softly, shaking his head, as if my entire existence was nothing more than a harmless, pitiful joke. He looked at Jamal with deep admiration, clearly proud to have such a successful, benevolent son-in-law who was willing to hand out charity to his absolute failure of an eldest daughter. "Thank you, Jamal," my father said, raising his wine glass slightly in a toast. "It is good to see you trying to help your sister out. Lord knows she desperately needs some direction." I did not break character. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not defend my wardrobe or my career choices. I just let the silence stretch out, letting their cruel laughter fill the luxurious private dining room. In my mind, I was already calculating the exact sequence of events that was about to unfold. Jamal thought he was a big-shot corporate attorney. He thought his law firm was an untouchable fortress. He had absolutely no idea that for the past 6 months, my private equity group had been aggressively buying up the controlling shares of his parent company through a series of shell corporations. Just as Madeline was wiping a fake tear of amusement from her perfectly contoured cheek, my phone vibrated twice against my thigh. I slipped the device out of my leather bag and glanced at the screen under the table. It was a highly secure text message from my executive assistant. The message was brief and precise. "Acquisition finalized. The ink is completely dry. You now hold 73% of the voting shares, awaiting your command." I locked the screen and slid the phone smoothly back into my bag. A strange, serene calm washed over my entire body. It was the exact kind of calm a predator feels right before the steel trap snaps shut. They were sitting there laughing at my clothes, mocking my supposed poverty, and offering me a minimum wage job out of sheer pity. They had no clue that the quiet woman they were openly humiliating had just legally become the ultimate boss of every single person sitting at that table. "That is a very interesting offer, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. "I will be sure to keep your firm in mind when I make my next career move. You might be surprised by how quickly things can shift in the corporate world." Jamal smirked, clearly missing the subtle, dangerous warning hidden in my words. Do not think about it too long, Natalie, he said, taking a slow sip of his sparkling water. Opportunities like this do not wait around for people who drag their feet. I smiled back at him, a genuine, terrifying smile that did not quite reach my eyes. You are absolutely right, I replied quietly. The silence that followed my remark was abruptly broken by the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swinging open. A distinguished sommelier dressed in a crisp black suit stepped into the room, carrying a thick leather-bound wine list. He approached the table with quiet reverence, instinctively moving toward my father as the guest of honor. But before my father could even reach for the menu, Sylvia aggressively snatched it right out of the sommelier's hands. I will take care of the wine selection for my husband's birthday, she announced loudly, casting a sideways glance at me. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully in my lap, waiting for her next move. Sylvia flipped past the first few pages, completely ignoring the sections that featured perfectly fine, reasonably priced options. She was not looking for a good wine tonight. She was looking for a weapon. Her manicured fingernail dragged down the heavy parchment paper until it stopped at the very back of the book in the exclusive reserve section. We will take the Chateau Margaux, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, the vintage from 1990. And since we are celebrating a very special milestone tonight, we will not just take one. Bring us 3 bottles. The sommelier blinked, his professional composure faltering for just a fraction of a second. He looked at Sylvia, then briefly at my father. An excellent choice, madam, he said carefully. But I must inform you that the 1990 vintage is currently priced at $5,000 per bottle. Shall I still bring 3? Without missing a beat, Sylvia smiled her most venomous smile and looked directly into my eyes. Oh, the price is not an issue at all, she said smoothly. In fact, my lovely stepdaughter Natalie will be taking care of the entire bill tonight. It is the least she can do. The sommelier bowed his head and quickly exited the room, eager to escape the suffocating tension that had just descended upon our table. I did not gasp. I did not widen my eyes in shock. I simply looked at Sylvia, who was practically vibrating with malicious delight. $15,000 in wine alone, plus the cost of a private dining room at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan. She had just casually attempted to drop a $20,000 financial anvil on my shoulders, fully believing it would crush me. This is such a wonderful gesture, Natalie. Sylvia continued, raising her voice so the waitstaff refilling the water glasses could hear every single word. As the eldest daughter, it is only right that you show your dedication to the family. You have been so absent lately, so wrapped up in your little clerical job. Paying for your father's birthday dinner is a beautiful way to prove that you still respect the hierarchy of this family. I turned my gaze to my father, waiting to see if he would intervene. I waited to see if the man who gave me half of my DNA would stop his younger wife from financially abusing his own child. Instead, Richard nodded slowly, adjusting his napkin on his lap. Your mother makes a valid point, Natalie, he said, his tone thick with paternal pressure. You are 34, you do not own a home, you do not have a husband, and you have never contributed anything of real substance to this family. Taking care of the check tonight would show me that you are finally ready to step up and take some responsibility. It would show that you are not entirely selfish. Madeline clapped her hands together, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly against each other. Oh my gosh, yes, she squealed. That is actually so sweet of you, Nat. Jamal and I were just talking about how you never bring anything to family events. This totally makes up for that embarrassing paper card you tried to give Dad earlier. Jamal leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest with a look of supreme arrogance. It is basic familial equity, Natalie, he added, using his booming courtroom voice to ensure everyone in the vicinity heard him. You consume the resources of this family by sitting at this table. It is legally and morally sound for you to offset that burden by footing the bill. Consider it a late tax for all the times your father had to bail you out financially when you were younger. Not that he ever actually bailed me out. I paid my own way through college by working 2 jobs, while Madeline got a brand new luxury SUV for getting a passing grade in high school. The sheer audacity of their demands hung heavily in the air. They were all staring at me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to stutter to admit I did not have $20,000 to my name, to beg them for help so they could lord it over me for the rest of my life. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. Then I placed the crystal glass softly back onto the white tablecloth. I am afraid there has been a slight misunderstanding. I said, my voice cutting through the smug silence of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. I will not be paying for 3 bottles of $5,000 wine that I did not order. In fact, I will not be paying for anyone else at this table. I will cover the cost of my own food and my own water. The rest of this extravagant birthday celebration is entirely on you. Jamal slammed his hand flat against the table. You cannot be serious, he barked, his courtroom persona taking full control of the room. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned forward, treating our dining table like a witness stand. This is exactly the kind of regressive behavior that keeps you stuck at the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, Natalie. He adjusted his silk tie and launched into a full legal lecture entirely unprompted. Let us talk about the social contract of the family unit. There is an implied fiduciary duty here. Your father provided for you for 18 years. He housed you. He fed you. Under the basic principles of family equity, you owe a moral and financial debt to this estate. Refusing to pay for a celebratory dinner is not just cheap, it is a breach of your fundamental obligations to the patriarch of this family. Madeline nodded enthusiastically, even though she almost certainly did not understand half the legal terminology her husband just used. Exactly, she chimed in, swirling the ice in her water glass. You are just being toxic, Nat. You always do this. You ruin the vibe because you are too bitter to just celebrate other people. I looked at Jamal, taking in his puffed-up chest and his aggressive, domineering posture. There is no legal precedent for a retroactive tax on childhood, Jamal Rice replied, my voice remaining perfectly even. And if we are going to audit the family equity, I believe we would find that the ledger is heavily skewed in Madeline's favor. I am simply declining to participate in a financial transaction I did not authorize. That is not a breach of duty. That is basic financial literacy. Jamal's face flushed with anger. He hated being challenged, especially by someone he considered an intellectual and financial inferior. You are missing the big picture because you lack the vision to see beyond your meager paycheck, he snapped, pointing a manicured finger at me. This is about showing respect. It is about proving you are not just a constant drain on our collective resources. You are sitting in a room of high-value individuals, and instead of taking the opportunity to elevate yourself, you pull us all down with your poverty mindset. Before Jamal could launch into another unsolicited legal lecture, Sylvia let out an exaggerated theatrical groan. She tossed her crisp linen napkin onto her plate and glared at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. Oh, for heaven's sake, Jamal, stop trying to reason with her! Sylvia interrupted, her voice dripping with venom. You cannot teach class to someone who insists on wallowing in the mud. If she wants to sit there and count her pennies like a miserable little miser, let her. I will not have my husband's birthday ruined by her pathetic inferiority complex. Sylvia reached into her oversized designer handbag, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking loudly against each other. With a dramatic flick of her wrist, she pulled out a thick metallic platinum credit card and slapped it onto the center of the table. The heavy metal made a sharp, satisfying smack against the polished mahogany. I will pay for the dinner, Sylvia announced, looking around the room to ensure she had a captive audience. Because unlike some people at this table, I actually know how to generate real wealth. In fact, I did not want to mention this until dessert, but my company just closed a massive Series A funding round this morning. We secured $15 million in venture capital from a top-tier investment firm. I felt a slight twitch at the corner of my mouth, but I suppressed the smile instantly. $15 million. She was bragging about the exact sum of money my firm Apex Private Equity had just wired into her corporate account under the guise of an anonymous venture capital subsidiary. She thought she had conquered the business world, completely unaware that I was the one pulling the strings behind the curtain. I had read every single page of her fraudulent business plan. I knew every lie she told to get that money, and I knew exactly how quickly I was going to take it all back. But I kept my face blank, letting her enjoy her final moments of manufactured glory. My father beamed with pride, reaching out to pat Sylvia's hand affectionately. She is a self-made mogul, he boasted to Jamal and Madeline, completely ignoring my presence. I always knew Lumiere Aesthetics would revolutionize the industry. It takes incredible vision and relentless drive to secure that kind of capital in today's market. Sylvia continued puffing out her chest and lifting her chin. She turned her icy, triumphant gaze back to me. $15 million, Natalie. That is what real success looks like. I built a luxury empire from the ground up while you are still pushing papers in a cubicle and refusing to buy your own father a glass of wine. She picked up her glass of champagne, holding it like a trophy. You are nothing but a financial parasite, Natalie. You feed off the energy of successful people because you cannot create a single thing of your own. You come to these dinners, you eat the food we pay for you, sit in the beautiful rooms we rent, and you contribute absolutely nothing to the legacy of this family. You are an absolute embarrassment to the word business. She looked around the table, basking in the admiring nods of my father, my sister, and Jamal. They were all completely intoxicated by her lies, blinded by the shiny platinum card sitting on the table. They worshipped the illusion of wealth she projected. Waiter, Sylvia called out sharply, snapping her fingers in the air toward the door. Come here and take this card. Charge the wine, charge the dinner, and bring us the most expensive caviar you have on the menu. We are celebrating the fact that some of us actually have a future worth toasting to. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I watched the restaurant manager walk over to the table and pick up the heavy metal card. I knew exactly what was going to happen next, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The wait was agonizingly slow for them, but for me, it was pure entertainment. For the next few minutes, Sylvia held court at the table, completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. She talked at length about her new venture capital partners, boasting about how they practically begged her to take their money. She described the Italian marble she planned to install in the lobby of her aesthetics clinic. My father hung on to her every word, his chest puffed out with pride. Madeline and Jamal nodded along, occasionally throwing pitying glances in my direction. They were fully convinced that Sylvia had just secured her place among the elite. Sylvia even leaned across the table, swirling her champagne, and asked me if my little accounting office offered free coffee, or if we had to bring our own mugs. I just smiled, a small, knowing curve of my lips. You would be surprised by what goes on in my office. Sylvia, I replied softly. Before she could deliver another insult, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. The restaurant manager stepped inside. His posture had completely changed. Earlier, he had walked with the confident grace required at a Michelin star establishment. Now his face was pale, his shoulders were tense, and he was not holding a leather booklet with a receipt to sign. He was holding Sylvia's platinum card between his thumb and index finger, carrying it as if it were a live grenade. The conversation at the table slowly died down as everyone noticed his grim expression. The manager approached Sylvia, leaning down awkwardly to ensure his voice remained a discreet whisper. Excuse me, madam. He began, his voice trembling slightly. I am terribly sorry to interrupt your celebration. Sylvia waved her hand dismissively, not even looking at him. Just put the receipt on the table, she commanded. I will sign it after we finish the caviar. The manager did not move. He swallowed hard, looking pleadingly at my father, then back to Sylvia. Madame, I cannot bring the receipt, he said, his voice dropping even lower. Your card has been declined. The word hung in the air, thick and heavy. Sylvia froze her champagne glass halfway to her mouth. She slowly turned her head to look at the manager, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. Excuse me? She snapped, her voice no longer a whisper. What did you just say? I am so sorry, madam, the manager repeated, sweating visibly under the collar of his crisp white shirt. The machine declined the transaction. I tried it twice just to be absolutely certain. Sylvia let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She slammed her glass down on the table, spilling champagne onto the white linen. "That is impossible," she declared loudly. "Do you have any idea who I am? I just deposited $15 million into that account this morning. Your machine is obviously broken. Go back out there and run it again." The manager took a step back, intimidated by her sudden aggression. "I assure you, madam, our systems are working perfectly." Because of the unusually high balance of the dinner, I actually took the liberty of calling the merchant services hotline to push the transaction through manually. Sylvia's face flushed a deep, angry red. "And what did they tell you?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shout. "They informed me that they could not process any transactions," the manager said, his voice shaking. "The bank representative stated that there is a hard federal freeze on all of your assets. The account is completely locked. A hard federal freeze." The words hit the table like a physical blow. Richard gasped, his face draining of color. Madeline clamped her hand over her mouth. Jamal sat up perfectly straight, his lawyer instincts instantly kicking in. Sylvia erupted. She pushed her chair back violently, the wood scraping loudly against the marble floor. She stood up, towering over the terrified manager. "Are you calling me a criminal?" she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of high society elegance. "You incompetent fool. My accounts are not frozen. I am the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar company. This is a banking error, and I am going to have you fired." The commotion was so loud that the heavy doors cracked open. Patrons in the main dining room turned their heads to stare at the wealthy woman losing her mind. My father frantically reached out, grabbing her wrist. "Sylvia, please keep your voice down," Richard hissed, his face burning with humiliation. "We are making a scene." "I do not care," Sylvia shrieked. "I want to speak to the owner right now." The manager maintained his professional composure. "Madam, the owner cannot override a federal bank freeze. You will need to contact your financial institution. But the balance for this dinner still needs to be settled." I remained seated perfectly still. I did not say a word. I just watched the magnificent collapse of her carefully constructed illusion. The first domino had officially fallen. The manager stood his ground, his face pale, but his posture rigid. He placed Sylvia's useless metal card softly on the edge of the table, as if it were contaminated. The finality of his gesture sent a wave of raw panic rippling through the room. Sylvia stared at the card, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, the sheer shock finally short-circuiting her rage. She had spent the last hour bragging about her multi-million-dollar empire, and now she could not even buy a glass of tap water. My father pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "This is a disaster," he muttered, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and deep, agonizing humiliation. He glanced nervously toward the crack in the door, where the soft jazz music of the main dining room was being entirely overshadowed by the whispered gossip of New York's elite. They were watching us. Were watching. The wealthy families Richard so desperately wanted to impress were currently witnessing his wife default on a dinner bill. Jamal cleared his throat loudly, aggressively adjusting the lapels of his custom suit. He could not handle the shift in the power dynamic. To a corporate lawyer whose entire identity was built on financial dominance and perceived superiority, sitting at a table that could not settle its tab was a fate worse than death. He needed to be the savior. He needed to prove he was still the alpha male in the room. "Let us all just take a breath," Jamal said, using his deepest, most authoritative courtroom voice. "There is obviously a systemic glitch with her bank. It happens all the time with these high-volume commercial accounts. Security algorithms get triggered unnecessarily." He reached into his breast pocket and smoothly pulled out a sleek, heavy corporate credit card. "Here," Jamal said, sliding the card across the table toward the manager with a condescending smirk. "Put the entire balance on this. Let us put an end to this ridiculous spectacle so we can finish our evening in peace." Madeline let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of relief, placing her hand over her heart. "Oh, thank goodness you are here, Jamal," she cooed, casting a smug look in my direction. "See, Natalie, this is what a real man does. He steps up and handles the situation when things get complicated. You should be taking notes. I did not say a word. I just watched the manager pick up Jamal's card. He pulled a sleek handheld payment terminal from his apron and inserted the chip. The machine displayed a small spinning circle on its digital screen. The entire table held its breath. Sylvia slumped back in her chair, still clutching her empty champagne glass. My father wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Jamal leaned back, lacing his fingers together behind his head, entirely confident in his boundless credit limit. The machine let out a sharp electronic beep. The screen flashed bright red. The manager stared at the terminal. He removed the card, wiped the chip on his sleeve, and inserted it again. The spinning circle appeared for a second before the machine emitted another loud, unforgiving beep. Red screen. Declined. The manager cleared his throat, avoiding Jamal's eyes. Sir, I am afraid your card has also been declined. Jamal's confident smirk instantly vanished. He sat up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. What did you just say? He demanded, dropping his hands to the table. That is a corporate account linked directly to my law firm's primary operating fund. There is over $2 million of liquid capital in that account. Run it again right now. I have run it twice, sir. The manager replied, his voice tight with anxiety. The terminal is reading the exact same error code as the previous card. Account frozen. Contact issuing institution. Madeline let out a high-pitched gasp. Jamal, what does that mean? Why is your card frozen? Are we broke? Shut up, Madeline. Jamal snapped, completely losing his composed, gentlemanly facade. He grabbed his phone and furiously started tapping the screen, his thumbs moving at lightning speed as he tried to log into his banking app. This is absurd. Someone must have compromised the firm's firewall. I am going to sue this bank into the Stone Age. The panic in the room was palpable. It had a distinct scent, sour and metallic, entirely overpowering the aroma of the expensive food sitting untouched on our plates. Sylvia was hyperventilating furiously, typing messages to her invisible venture capital partners, who would never reply. Madeline was tugging at her diamond necklace, looking frantically between her husband and her mother-in-law. My father looked physically ill. The patriarch of the family, the man who had mocked my handmade gift just an hour ago, was now trapped in a luxury cage with a $20,000 bill and a family full of fraudulent bank accounts. The whispers from the hallway grew louder. He slowly turned his head and looked at me, a desperate unspoken plea forming in his eyes. I took a bite of my perfectly seared sea bass, chewed slowly and swallowed. I blotted my lips with my linen napkin, taking my absolute time. The chaos was swirling around me like a hurricane, but I was sitting comfortably in the eye of the storm. The manager was practically vibrating with anxiety, trapped between my father's furious whispering and Sylvia's frantic typing. Jamal was demanding the manager call the fraud department immediately, insisting that his law firm's server must have been hacked by a foreign entity. Madeline was on the verge of tears, mourning the sudden death of her perceived social status as she stared blankly at her husband's rejected piece of plastic. The heavy mahogany doors remained slightly ajar, and the whispers from the hallway were growing bolder. The elite circles of Manhattan were watching the magnificent implosion of my family's fabricated empire. I calmly pushed my chair back just a few inches. The soft scraping sound cut through the frantic bickering. I reached down into my modest leather bag. It was the exact same bag Sylvia had called a tragic thrift store find earlier that evening. I bypassed my standard personal debit card and slipped 2 fingers into the hidden zipper compartment. I felt the cold, heavy titanium of my corporate account. I pulled out the sleek, unbranded black metal card. The American Express Centurion. The black card. It is not something you can just apply for online or ask your local bank teller to issue. It is an invitation-only asset reserved strictly for individuals with staggering net worths and massive corporate spending power. It does not have a preset spending limit. It commands absolute respect anywhere in the world. And right now, it was sitting casually between my index and middle finger. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise of the room. The manager turned to me, looking like a drowning man who had just been thrown a life preserver. I extended my hand across the white tablecloth, offering him the heavy titanium card. "Please run this," I instructed smoothly, my voice completely devoid of arrogance but carrying undeniable authority, and put the entire balance of the evening under the primary account for Apex Private Equity. The manager blinked, staring at the black card in my hand as if it were a physical impossibility. He had spent the last hour watching my family treat me like a destitute servant. He carefully took the card from me, his fingers grazing the cold metal, instantly recognizing its weight and authenticity. "Right away, madam," he said, his posture instantly straightening from a defensive slouch into a position of absolute deference. He turned his back to the table, hands trembling slightly as he inserted the chip into his handheld terminal. The entire room went dead silent. The frantic tapping on Sylvia's phone screen stopped abruptly. My father stopped breathing, his eyes locked on the black card disappearing into the machine. Madeline stared blankly, her brain struggling to process how the sister she had just mocked for wearing hand-me-downs was suddenly holding the most exclusive financial instrument on the planet. But it was Jamal whose reaction was the most satisfying. Jamal froze completely. As a high-powered corporate lawyer operating in the cutthroat environment of Manhattan, his entire career revolved around knowing the major players on Wall Street. He studied the market. He knew the apex predators of the financial world, and he most definitely knew Apex Private Equity. They were a ruthless multi-billion-dollar firm known for aggressive corporate takeovers, hostile buyouts, and absolute market dominance. They were the kind of firm that could swallow his entire law practice whole without blinking. "Wait." Jamal stammered, his booming courtroom confidence entirely evaporating into thin air. His eyes darted wildly from the payment terminal back to my face, his jaw practically hitting the floor. "What did you just say? Did you just say Apex Private Equity?" Before I could even acknowledge his question, the payment terminal let out a soft, pleasant chime. The screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green. Approved. The manager let out a long, audible breath of relief. The machine quickly printed out the lengthy receipt. The manager carefully tore the paper, placed it inside a sleek leather folio, along with my black card, and stepped back up to the table. He completely bypassed my father. He ignored Jamal. He walked straight over to me and set the folio respectfully next to my water glass. "Thank you, madam," the manager said, bowing his head slightly in a show of deep respect. "Your authorization was completely successful. I will leave you and your family to enjoy the rest of your evening in peace." He turned and quickly exited the room, pulling the heavy mahogany doors tightly shut behind him. The click of the door latch sounded like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. He left behind a silence so thick and suffocating you could have cut it with a steak knife. The $20,000 dinner had been paid in full. The crisis with the restaurant was over. But the true nightmare for my family was only just beginning. The heavy silence in the room lasted for exactly 10 seconds before Sylvia violently shattered it. She slammed her hands down on the table, her knuckles turning white, and glared at me with a mixture of terror and unhinged rage. "Are you insane?" Sylvia shrieked, her voice cracking under the pressure of the moment. "What did you just do? You stole a corporate credit card. You actually stole a black card from whatever pathetic little firm you work for and brought it here to show off. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in right now?" My father looked like he was about to pass out. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles pale. "Natalie, tell me you did not steal that card," he whispered hoarsely, looking around as if the federal authorities were about to burst through the doors. "Fraud on this scale is a massive federal offense. They will lock you away for decades. You have ruined everything." "I am calling the police," Sylvia announced, scrambling to grab her phone from her designer purse. "I will not be an accessory to grand larceny. I knew you were a complete failure, Natalie, but I did not think you were a common criminal willing to drag this family into a federal investigation." While Sylvia and my father panicked, Jamal was entirely motionless. His arrogant courtroom demeanor was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound, sickening realization. As a corporate lawyer, his brain was rapidly processing the impossibilities of the situation. He knew the strict security protocols of the Wall Street elite. He knew that an American Express Centurion card issued to Apex Private Equity could not simply be swiped off a manager's desk by a low-level clerk. Those cards were heavily encrypted, aggressively monitored, and strictly reserved for the absolute top tier of the executive board. "Wait," Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. That card had her name on it. I saw it when the manager walked away. It said Natalie. How does a data entry accountant have an Apex Centurion card? Madeline looked back and forth between her husband and me, her face scrunched up in confusion. "Jamal, what is Apex Private Equity?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it a big deal?" "It is a multi-billion-dollar financial institution," Jamal replied mechanically, never taking his eyes off me. "They do hostile corporate takeovers. They dismantle failing companies for breakfast. An entry-level clerk does not get that card under any circumstances." I took another sip of my sparkling water, relishing the absolute chaos I had just created. I placed the crystal glass down and locked eyes with Sylvia, who was aggressively tapping her phone screen trying to dial the police. "Put the phone down, Sylvia," I said, my voice dangerously calm and laced with authority. "Unless you want the authorities to take a very close look at your own financial records tonight, I highly suggest you sit back down and keep quiet." She froze, her manicured finger hovering just above the screen. "You are a thief," she hissed, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. The time for hiding was officially over. "I do not steal from the company I founded, Sylvia," I stated clearly, every single word landing like a physical blow against her fragile ego. The room stopped breathing entirely. Sylvia stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the gears in her head grinding to a violent halt. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "I am not a low-level accountant." I continued, my voice steady and commanding the entire room. "I do not push papers in a cubicle, and I certainly do not need a minimum-wage data entry job at Jamal's second-rate law firm. For the past 6 years, I have been the senior partner and lead forensic auditor of Apex Private Equity. I personally own 51% of the voting shares. The card I just handed the manager is tied to my primary operating account, which currently holds more liquid capital than this entire restaurant generates in a decade." Richard sank back into his chair, the color completely draining from his face. He had spent his entire life obsessing over wealth and status, ignoring his eldest daughter because he thought she was a financial failure. Now, sitting directly across from him was an absolute Wall Street titan. "You," my father stammered, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "You are a senior partner at a billion-dollar firm. Why did you never tell us this?" "Because," I replied coldly, leaning back in my chair, "I wanted to see exactly how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing, and you all performed exactly as I expected." Sylvia shook her head frantically, refusing to accept the reality that her entire worldview was crumbling around her. "No, this is a lie," she sputtered, her voice rising in panic. "You are making this up to cover your tracks. You are trying to scare us." "Am I?" I asked softly, a sharp, predatory smile forming on my face. "Let us talk about who is really covering their tracks." Sylvia let out a forced, high-pitched laugh. It was a brittle sound, completely devoid of any real humor. She looked around the table, desperately seeking an ally, hoping someone would join in her delusion. "Covering my tracks," she scoffed. "You are completely delusional, Natalie. Do you actually expect anyone here to believe this ridiculous fantasy?" She crossed her arms tightly over her silk gown, trying to rebuild the shattered armor of her high society persona. "You think you can just wave a piece of metal around and pretend you are some Wall Street mastermind? You probably stole that card from your boss. And now you are making up these insane stories to justify your pathetic, jealous little life. My business is worth millions. I have real investors. You have nothing but a cheap suit and a bitter attitude." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout to be heard. I rested my elbows gently on the polished mahogany table, interlaced my fingers and leaned forward. I closed the physical space between us, forcing her to look directly into my cold eyes. Those real investors you are so incredibly proud of, Sylvia. I began, my voice smooth and lethal. The prestigious venture capital firm that just wired $15 million into your corporate accounts this morning. That was me. Sylvia blinked. Her forced, arrogant smile froze on her face, slowly turning into a grimace of pure confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. And by the way, I continued savoring the absolute destruction of her reality. The person who ordered the federal freeze on all of your bank accounts 10 minutes ago. That was also me. The words landed like a physical bomb in the dead center of the dining table. The color completely drained from Sylvia's perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Her hands began to tremble violently. She looked down at her empty hands, then back at me, the terrifying truth finally penetrating her thick skull. She was not a brilliant business owner. She was a mouse caught in a trap I had set months ago. My father, who had been sitting in a state of stunned paralysis, suddenly slammed his fist down onto the table. The expensive crystal wine glasses vibrated against the plates. "Natalie, what in the world are you doing to my wife's business?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking, with a mix of panic and lingering paternal authority. "Are you actively trying to destroy our family? If you really are who you say you are, why are you sabotaging her company? Unfreeze those accounts right now." I shifted my gaze to my father. For 34 years I had craved this man's approval. I had wanted him to look at me the way he looked at Madeline, with pride and affection. But looking at him now, seeing the sweat beading on his forehead and the desperate, pathetic fear in his eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional hold he once had over me was entirely gone. "I am not sabotaging anything, Richard," they replied coldly. "I am simply conducting a standard financial audit on an asset I now effectively own. When my firm injected that capital into Lumiere Aesthetics, we acquired the legal right to monitor the cash flow. And what I found was not a legitimate, thriving beauty business. What I found was a massive, highly illegal financial sinkhole." Jamal leaned forward, his corporate lawyer instincts momentarily overriding his profound shock. He understood the severe legal implications of what I was saying better than anyone else in the room. "Wait. You are saying Apex Private Equity is the primary investor in Lumiere. Natalie, if you initiated a hard federal freeze, that implies you found concrete evidence of criminal fraud. You cannot just throw around accusations like that. The liability alone would be astronomical. If you are wrong, Sylvia can sue you for everything you have." I turned my attention to my arrogant brother-in-law. "I do not make empty accusations, Jamal. I state facts backed by irrefutable paper trails. Sylvia has been running a pathetic shell game, and unfortunately for her, she decided to play that game using my money." Sylvia shook her head wildly, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. "Do not listen to her, Richard," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. "She is lying. My clinic is completely legitimate. We have high-end clients. We have state-of-the-art medical equipment. She is just trying to humiliate me because she is a miserable, lonely woman." "You have leased equipment, Sylvia," I corrected her smoothly, cutting off her hysterical rant. "You have fake vendor invoices offshore, holding accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a severe deficit in actual revenue. You spent the entire morning celebrating a venture capital injection, completely unaware that the money was just bait. It was a trap designed to map out exactly where you have been hiding the stolen funds." Sylvia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The revelation that her entire fraudulent empire had been mapped out and cornered by the very stepdaughter she had just mocked, completely short-circuited her brain. My father slumped further into his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to wake up from a horrific nightmare. But Jamal was not ready to surrender. He was a high-powered corporate attorney. His entire identity was forged in the fires of courtroom battles and aggressive legal intimidation. He could not stand the fact that a woman he had just offered a minimum-wage data entry job was currently commanding the room and dismantling his mother-in-law with surgical precision. Jamal stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the marble floor. He buttoned the center button of his custom Tom Ford jacket, a physical gesture meant to signal that playtime was over and the real authority had arrived. He leaned his heavy frame over the mahogany table, glaring down at me with absolute fury. "You think you are playing a smart game, Natalie?" Jamal boomed, his voice vibrating with aggressive legal authority. "But you just admitted to federal crimes in a room full of witnesses. If you actually initiated a freeze on her assets using a shell corporation as bait, you have crossed a massive legal line. I am talking about tortious interference with business contracts, corporate espionage, and malicious financial entrapment." I did not shrink back. I kept my eyes locked on his, my expression perfectly serene. "Please, Jamal," I said softly. "Do go on. I love it when you try to sound intimidating. Do not patronize me," he snapped, pointing a long, rigid finger directly at my face. "I practice corporate litigation at one of the top firms in Manhattan. I know the federal statutes inside and out. Under Title 18 of the United States Code. What you just described is wire fraud and unauthorized financial manipulation. I will personally file an injunction by tomorrow morning to release those funds. And then I am going to draft a civil suit for damages that will bankrupt you and whatever rogue firm lets you run this illegal operation." Madeline sat up straighter, empowered by her husband's sudden aggressive display. "You tell her, Jamal," she chimed in, her voice shrill and vindictive. "You cannot just come in here and bully our family, Natalie. Jamal is going to destroy you in court. You are going to prison for this." Jamal did not even look at his wife. His eyes were burning holes into me. "I'm going to have the Federal Trade Commission breathing down your neck before the weekend." He continued, his tone thick with self-righteous anger. "I will drag you through years of brutal litigation. I will have your professional licenses completely revoked. You are going to lose everything you own, and when I am done with you, you will be begging me for that entry-level job just to pay off your legal debts. You messed with the wrong family, Natalie, and you definitely messed with the wrong lawyer." He stood there breathing heavily, looking incredibly proud of his impromptu legal monologue. My father looked up at him with a glimmer of desperate hope, praying that his brilliant son-in-law could somehow legally bully me into backing down. Sylvia had stopped crying and was now glaring at me, waiting for me to break down and apologize. I let a few seconds of silence pass. I wanted the echo of his threats to completely settle into the walls of the room. Then, very slowly, I allowed a genuine razor-sharp smile to spread across my face. "That was a very impressive closing argument, Jamal," I said, reaching back into my leather bag. "You have a wonderful speaking voice, very commanding. It is a shame your actual legal comprehension does not match your volume." I pulled my phone out and unlocked the screen. Jamal narrowed his eyes, clearly frustrated that his aggressive intimidation tactics had absolutely no effect on my heart rate. "What are you doing?" he demanded tightly. "Are you calling your lawyers?" "Because they cannot save you from what I'm about to do. I am not calling anyone," I replied, tapping the screen a few times with quiet precision. "But a good lawyer should always review the discovery files before making threats they cannot back up. You left your iPad sitting on the table, Jamal. I highly suggest you open it." Jamal frowned, glancing down at the sleek silver tablet resting next to his water glass. A soft ping echoed through the quiet room. A notification popped up on his screen. "I just sent an airdrop to your device," I explained smoothly, sliding my phone back into my bag. "It is a highly confidential PDF document. Since you are so eager to discuss corporate law and business contracts, I figured you might want to read the latest acquisition file my team finalized just a few hours ago." Jamal hesitated. His legal instincts were screaming at him not to open an unsolicited file, but his massive ego and morbid curiosity overrode his caution. He picked up the tablet, his large hands gripping the edges tightly. The glare of the screen illuminated his face as he tapped the notification to accept the file transfer. Madeline leaned over, trying to peek at the screen, but Jamal angled it away from her. "What is it, Jamal?" she asked nervously. "Is it fake? Tell us it is fake." I leaned comfortably back in my chair, watching the exact moment the color began to drain from his face. Go ahead, counselor, I prompted softly. Read the title of the document out loud for the rest of the table. Let us see how much leverage you really have. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. He stared at the glowing screen of his tablet, his eyes darting frantically back and forth across the bold black text at the top of the document. I watched the arrogant fire in his eyes extinguish in real time, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. The silence in the private dining room was deafening. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. Read it, Jamal, I commanded, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded more authority than his loudest courtroom shout. Read it so everyone can hear exactly who is going out of business tonight. He opened his mouth, but his voice completely failed him. He let out a dry, raspy breath. I cannot, he whispered, shaking his head. This cannot be real. The senior partners would never authorize this kind of sale. They would never surrender controlling interest without a board vote. Oh, they voted, I assured him cheerfully. We offered them a buyout they simply could not refuse. Cash up front, fully liquid, with complete immunity from the impending audits. They took the money and ran Jamal. Now read the title. His hands were shaking so violently that the silver tablet vibrated. He cleared his throat, but his voice was completely stripped of its former bravado. It sounded thin, fragile, and utterly defeated. Notice of finalized corporate acquisition. He read aloud, his voice trembling. Between Apex Private Equity and the managing partners of... He paused, choking on the words. Say the name of your firm, Jamal, I urged smoothly. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Between Apex Private Equity and the managing partners of your law firm, Madeline gasped loudly, gripping the edge of the table. Wait, she cried out, her eyes wide with panic. That is your firm, Jamal. What does an acquisition mean? What does she mean she bought it? Jamal did not answer his wife. He was too busy reading the executive summary on the second page of the document. His eyes widened as he processed the legal jargon that he usually weaponized against others. Now that same jargon was wrapping around his own neck like a noose. It means exactly what it sounds like. Madeline, I answered for her, keeping my eyes locked on Jamal's crumbling facade. As of 3:00 this afternoon, Apex Private Equity holds a 73% controlling stake in his entire legal practice. We own the leases to his office building. We own the server networks. We own the client lists. And most importantly, we own the employment contracts of every single attorney on the payroll, including your husband. Jamal physically dropped the tablet. It hit the mahogany table with a loud clatter, sliding a few inches before coming to a stop next to his untouched plate of caviar. He stumbled backward, his legs hitting his chair, almost knocking it over. You are my boss, he breathed out, the realization finally hitting him with the force of a freight train. I am not just your boss, Jamal, I corrected him gently. I am the ultimate authority over your entire career. I am the person who decides if you keep your corner office. I am the person who signs your paychecks, and I am the person who has the absolute power to terminate your contract with cause, stripping you of your equity, and leaving you with absolutely nothing. He looked like he was going to be sick. The man who had just 10 minutes ago offered me a minimum wage data entry job, who had lectured me on family equity and poverty mindsets, was now staring at me like I was the grim reaper of his professional existence. This is impossible, he stammered frantically, loosening his expensive silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. You are an auditor. You cannot just swoop in and buy a Tier 1 law firm. The conflict of interest alone makes this completely unfeasible. There is no conflict of interest when you structure the holding companies correctly, I interrupted, using the exact condescending tone he had used on me all evening. You would know that if you were half the brilliant corporate lawyer you pretend to be. But you are not brilliant, Jamal. You are just loud. My father was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, completely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of power I was casually wielding. Sylvia had sunk so low in her chair, she looked like she was trying to melt into the floorboards. Jamal placed both hands on his head, pacing a tight circle behind his chair. "This is retaliation," he muttered frantically, trying to piece together a defense that no longer existed. "This is malicious." "It is business, Jamal," I said, taking a slow sip of my water. "I just happen to be much better at it than you are." Madeline stood up, her face flushed red with anger and confusion. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You cannot do this, Natalie. You cannot just buy his company and threaten him. My husband is a respected attorney. He has high-profile clients. If you fire him, they will all leave with him. He will start his own firm and crush you." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was the first real emotion I had shown all night, and it chilled the room entirely. "Oh, Madeline." I sighed, shaking my head. "You really do not understand how any of this works, do you? Jamal cannot take his clients anywhere. He signed a very strict non-compete clause when he made junior partner, a clause that Apex Private Equity now legally enforces. If he tries to poach a single client, I will sue him into absolute oblivion." Jamal stopped pacing. He stared at his wife, his eyes filled with a terrifying emptiness. "She is right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The non-compete is ironclad. If she fires me with cause, I cannot practice corporate law in the state of New York for 5 years." Madeline's jaw dropped. She looked at Jamal, expecting him to fight back, expecting the aggressive alpha male she married to pull off a miraculous legal victory. But Jamal was completely broken. He was standing there, a defeated man in a custom suit, realizing that his entire identity, his wealth and his social status were entirely at my mercy. I smiled warmly at him. "And believe me, Jamal," I continued, my voice dripping with sweet venom, "I have plenty of cause. As the new majority shareholder of your prestigious law firm, it was my fiduciary duty to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of your recent case files. I told you earlier that I am a forensic auditor by trade. Finding hidden money is what I do best. So naturally, I had my team look very closely at the accounts you manage personally." Jamal took a step back, his shoulders practically collapsing inward. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I turned my gaze toward my younger half-sister. Madeline was still standing, her face a mask of furious indignation, completely unaware that the crosshairs had just shifted directly onto her. "Let us talk about Madeline's beautiful philanthropic endeavors," I said, leaning back and resting my hands on the armrests of my chair. "Madeline loves to host those extravagant galas. The Hope Foundation for Underprivileged Youth. It sounds so incredibly noble. You get to wear designer gowns, sip champagne with the city elite, and pretend you are saving the world while looking down on people who actually work for a living." Madeline crossed her arms defensively. "My charity does amazing work," she snapped, though her voice wavered slightly. "We raise hundreds of thousands of dollars every single year." "Yes, you certainly do raise a lot of money," I agreed smoothly. "The problem is where that money actually goes." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut. He knew exactly what was coming. I looked back at him, my expression hardening into pure ice. "When I audited your private server, Jamal, I found the highly illegal tax shelters you drafted for your wife's fake charity. I found the dummy corporations you set up in Delaware. I found the meticulously forged expense reports. You used your legal credentials to establish offshore holding accounts to wash those charitable donations and funnel the money directly into Madeline's personal trust fund to pay for her imported cars, her designer jewelry, and your luxury vacations." Madeline gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Jamal, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to use his brilliant legal mind to explain it all away. But Jamal could not even look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, the realization of his absolute ruin crushing him under its weight. My father let out a choked sound, gripping the edge of the table as if the room were spinning. "Fraud," he whispered, looking at his youngest daughter in horror. "You are stealing from a charity. Do you know what the Internal Revenue Service does to attorneys who facilitate charity fraud?" "Jamal," I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "They do not just fire you. They do not just fine you. They completely dismantle your life. They freeze your assets, they seize your property, and they lock you in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. And since your wife is listed as the primary beneficiary of that trust, she will be sitting right in the cell next to yours. Madeline let out a loud sob, her knees buckling slightly. Jamal reached out to steady her, his hands trembling violently. The arrogant alpha male who had dominated every family gathering for the last 5 years was entirely gone. Please, Natalie. Jamal begged, his booming courtroom voice entirely replaced by the pathetic whimper of a broken man. Please do not turn those files over to the authorities. I will resign. I will walk away from the firm tomorrow. Just let us fix it. I will pay the money back. Do not send us to prison. I watched him beg. This was the man who had spent the last decade mocking my career, belittling my intelligence, and treating me like a peasant who should be grateful for the crumbs falling off his table. Just an hour ago, he had offered me a minimum wage job out of sheer spite. Now, he was pleading for his freedom. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I am not going to hand those files over to the federal authorities tonight, I said softly. Jamal let out a ragged gasp of relief, his shoulders slumping. Thank you. He breathed out. I am not finished. I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. I will keep those files locked in my secure server. But hear me clearly, Jamal. I own you. I own your career. I own your reputation. And I hold the keys to your freedom. If you ever speak to me disrespectfully again, if you ever look at me with that arrogant, condescending smirk, if you ever so much as breathe in my direction without my express permission, I will have you disbarred by Monday morning. I leaned forward, making sure he felt the full weight of my promise. I will send the unredacted files directly to the Ethics Board and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will lose your license, you will lose your wealth, and you will lose your freedom. Do you understand me? Jamal swallowed hard, tears of pure humiliation brimming in his eyes. Yes, he whispered, his head bowed in complete submission. I understand perfectly. I understand perfectly. Jamal whispered, his head bowed in complete submission. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff and entirely mechanical. The aggressive, domineering posture he had carried into the restaurant was completely gone. He looked at Madeline, who was still crying, her perfectly applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She reached out for him, her hands trembling, expecting the comforting embrace of her protector. Jamal, do something. Madeline sobbed, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the room. Tell her she cannot do this to us. Tell Dad to make her stop right now. Jamal did not comfort her. He did not reassure her. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to make her gasp in surprise. Get your designer bag. Jamal ordered, his voice flat, breathless, and urgent. We are leaving. Right now. Madeline looked at him in sheer shock, her tears momentarily pausing. What do you mean we are leaving? We cannot just leave. We are in the middle of dinner. What about my charity gala next month? What about the trust fund money for the new house? There is no trust fund anymore. Madeline, Jamal hissed through clenched teeth, forcefully pulling her out of her chair. If we stay in this room for another 5 minutes, I'm going to lose my license to practice corporate law forever. Grab your coat. We are walking out that door, and we are never looking back. Sylvia, who had been sitting in a state of paralyzed horror, suddenly snapped back to reality. She saw her primary line of defense crumbling right before her eyes. She saw the wealthy, successful lawyer son-in-law preparing to abandon ship, taking her favorite daughter with him. Jamal, wait! Sylvia cried out, scrambling to her feet and reaching desperately across the table. You cannot just leave us here. My bank accounts are completely frozen. The restaurant manager is going to come back with security. You have to represent me. You are a brilliant corporate lawyer. You can draft a federal injunction just like you said. You have to help me fight her. Jamal stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head slowly to look at Sylvia, and the expression on his face was one of absolute, undisguised disgust. Are you completely out of your mind? Jamal snapped, his voice devoid of any familial warmth. I am not representing you, Sylvia. You just committed massive federal wire fraud using money from a private equity firm that now legally owns my entire career. You are entirely radioactive. If I associate with you in any legal capacity, I will be named as a co-conspirator in your financial crimes. You are on your own. But we are a family. Sylvia shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, grating pitch. You cannot do this to us. Richard, tell him he cannot do this. My father looked up from the table, his face pale and deeply drawn. He looked older than his 62 years, the stress aging him visibly by the second. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert his authority as the patriarch, but Jamal cut him off before he could even form a single syllable. Do not say a word to me, Richard, Jamal warned, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father. Your wife has completely ruined you, and she almost dragged me down into a federal prison with her. I am taking my wife, and we are leaving this miserable restaurant. Do not call my phone. Do not contact my law office. As of this exact second, we are completely severing all ties with your financial disaster. Madeline was openly weeping now, stumbling awkwardly in her high heels, as Jamal pulled her toward the heavy mahogany doors. She looked back at me over her shoulder, her tear-streaked face a mixture of pure terror and disbelief. The golden child, the sister who had spent her entire life mocking my clothes and my career, was being dragged out of a luxury restaurant like a criminal fleeing an active crime scene. Natalie, please! Madeline choked out, her voice cracking painfully. Please do not take my things. Please! I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply took another slow sip of my sparkling water and watched them go. Jamal threw the heavy doors open completely, ignoring the curious stares of the wealthy patrons in the main dining room. He pulled Madeline out into the brightly lit hallway, letting the doors slam shut behind them. The loud thud echoed with absolute finality. Just like that, the rats had successfully fled the sinking ship. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The loud, arrogant energy that Jamal and Madeline had provided was completely sucked out into the hallway. The fortress of superiority that Sylvia had built around herself was completely shattered. There were no more aggressive lawyers to threaten me with litigation. There were no more golden children to laugh at my expense. It was just me, my ruined father, and his fraudulent wife. Sylvia slowly sank back into her chair. Her hands were shaking so badly she accidentally knocked over her empty crystal champagne flute. The glass rolled across the white linen tablecloth and fell off the edge, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces on the hard marble floor. Neither of them moved to clean it up. Richard stared blankly at the shattered glass, the cold reality of his total isolation finally setting in. He had chosen Sylvia and Madeline over me his entire life. He had protected them, funded them, and allowed them to treat me like absolute garbage. And the absolute second the money ran out, the second the illusion of power was broken, they abandoned him without a single second thought. I folded my hands neatly on the table, resting my chin on my knuckles. I looked at the two of them, savoring the absolute suffocating silence that had fallen over the room. Well, I said softly, the single word cutting through the thick tension like a razor blade. Now that the dead weight has left the party, we can finally get down to the real business. Sylvia stared at me, her chest heaving as she tried to process my words. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal trapped in the headlights of an oncoming truck, but then her raw survival instinct kicked in. The delusion that had sustained her lavish lifestyle for the past decade flared up brightly, blinding her to the absolute reality of her grim situation. She refused to accept that a woman she had relentlessly mocked and belittled could hold such immense power over her. She slammed her open palms against the edge of the table and pushed herself up to a rigid standing position. She aggressively adjusted the neckline of her custom silk gown, lifting her chin in a pathetic attempt to reclaim her lost authority and command the room once more. You think you have won, Sylvia spat out, her voice trembling slightly but heavily laced with venomous defiance. You think you can just freeze my bank accounts and scare away Jamal and that automatically makes you the winner. You are incredibly naive, Natalie. You may have bullied your way into a partnership at some cutthroat firm, But you have absolutely no idea who you are actually dealing with. I leaned comfortably back in my chair, interlacing my fingers and resting them gracefully on my lap. I am listening, Sylvia. I said simply, my tone completely flat. Please enlighten me. Tell me exactly who I am dealing with. My father looked up at his wife, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a sudden desperate hope. He desperately wanted her to pull a rabbit out of the hat to prove that his entire life was not built on a fragile foundation of lies and financial fraud. My company is untouchable, Sylvia declared, her voice rising in pitch and volume until she was almost shouting at the ceiling. I am not some small-time startup you can just bully into submission. I have massive institutional backing. Just this morning, I finalized a $15 million investment from Vistara Capital. Do you know who they are, Natalie? Because if you do not, your little firm is about to find out the hard way. I kept my face entirely blank, not giving her a single ounce of satisfaction or any visible reaction. Vistara Capital is a global financial powerhouse. Sylvia continued, practically vibrating with renewed arrogance and false confidence. They are a massive venture capital conglomerate, and they believe in my vision. They believe in the future of Lumiere aesthetics. And more importantly, they ruthlessly protect their investments. When I call their managing directors tomorrow morning and tell them that Apex Private Equity illegally froze my operating accounts, they will unleash an army of corporate lawyers that will make Jamal look like a small-town traffic court attorney. Richard sat up slightly straighter, latching onto her words like a drowning man clutching a piece of floating driftwood. Sylvia, is that true? He asked, his voice trembling with a pathetic glimmer of hope. Vistara Capital really has their own legal team. They can fight this. They can force the bank to lift the freeze. Of course they can, Richard, Sylvia snapped, not even looking at him, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred as she glared directly at me. They are contractually obligated to protect the financial assets of my company. I signed a heavily negotiated ironclad investment agreement with them. Vistara has a massive vested interest in my success, and they will absolutely destroy anyone who tries to sabotage my operations. She leaned heavily across the mahogany table, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at my face. You made a fatal mistake tonight, Natalie. You let your petty jealousy override your basic business sense. You targeted the wrong company. Vistara Capital will sue you personally for tortious interference. They will sue Apex Private Equity for malicious corporate sabotage. They will drag you through federal court. They will strip you of your senior partnership, and they will leave you entirely bankrupt. By the time their aggressive lawyers are done with you, you will be begging me for a minimum wage job sweeping the floors of my luxury clinic. I watched her chest rise and fall as she delivered her grand, triumphant speech. She truly believed every single word she was saying. She had completely convinced herself that the $15 million magically appearing in her bank account was a testament to her sheer brilliance as an entrepreneur. She honestly thought she had secured a powerful, untouchable ally who would fight her battles and shield her from the devastating consequences of her own financial crimes. Are you quite finished? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, completely unfazed by her aggressive legal threats. Sylvia crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a smug, victorious sneer twisting her features. I am finished with you, yes, she said coldly. I suggest you call your bank and lift that freeze right now before I make a phone call that ends your entire career. My father let out a long breath, finally relaxing his grip on the edge of the table. Thank God, he muttered under his breath, wiping his sweaty palms on his expensive trousers. Natalie, listen to her. You are completely out of your depth here. Just undo whatever you did, and we can pretend this entire night never happened. I slowly uncrossed my legs and sat forward, resting my forearms on the perfectly white tablecloth. I looked at the two of them, a man blinded by his own vanity, and a woman intoxicated by her own delusion. The trap had been set perfectly, the bait had been swallowed whole, and now it was finally time to close the steel jaws permanently. I picked up my water glass, the crystal feeling cool and solid against my fingertips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them both incredibly uncomfortable. The ice clinked softly against the sides of the glass as I set it back down on the pristine white tablecloth. "You know, Sylvia," I began, my voice carrying a conversational, almost pleasant tone that stood in stark contrast to the venom she had just spit at me. "You really should read the fine print when you sign away equity in your company, especially when you are dealing with venture capital firms you have never actually met in person." Sylvia narrowed her eyes, her false confidence wavering slightly at my calm demeanor. "I met with their representatives," she said defensively. "We had multiple video conferences with the executive board. They loved my business model." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "Oh, they loved your business model, all right," I agreed. "They loved it because it was one of the most transparently fraudulent structures they had ever seen. It was practically a textbook case study in corporate money laundering." "What are you talking about?" she snapped, taking a step toward me. "Stop trying to twist this. Vistara Capital is a legitimate entity." "They are absolutely legitimate," I confirmed smoothly. "They have a brilliant legal team, massive financial reserves, and a sterling reputation in the corporate world. But there is one tiny little detail that those executive board members failed to mention during your video conferences." I paused, leaning forward just enough to ensure she caught every single syllable of my next sentence. "Vistara Capital is a ghost subsidiary. It is a shell company wholly owned and operated by Apex Private Equity." The words seemed to physically strike her. Sylvia stumbled backward, her heel catching on the thick Persian rug. She grabbed the back of her chair to steady herself, her knuckles turning bone white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, her perfectly manicured facade finally cracking completely. "No," she whispered, the single word escaping her lips like a dying breath. "Yes," I replied cheerfully. "Apex created Vistara specifically to handle high-risk specialized asset acquisitions. When your little aesthetics clinic popped up on our radar, flagged heavily by federal regulators for suspicious offshore wire transfers, by the way, we decided to take a closer look." I stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of my tailored blazer. I wanted to tower over her the way she had tried to tower over me. I was the anonymous lead investor, Sylvia. I was the one who approved the $15 million capital injection. I was the one who authorized the wire transfer into your accounts this morning. My father let out a choked gasp. He looked from me to Sylvia, his face contorted in absolute horror. "You," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You gave her the $15 million. "I did not give it to her, Richard," I corrected him sharply. "I used it as bait." I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I stopped just a few feet away from Sylvia, invading her personal space, forcing her to look up at me. "You see, Sylvia, you are incredibly arrogant. But you are not very smart," I explained, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You thought you had fooled the market. You thought you could just fake vendor invoices and funnel investor money into your personal Cayman accounts without anyone noticing. But the moment you accepted that Vistara money, you gave us full legal authorization to audit every single ledger, every single bank account, and every single digital footprint attached to Lumiere Aesthetics." Sylvia shook her head wildly, tears of pure terror finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. "You set me up!" she cried out, her voice echoing in the large, empty dining room. "You entrapped me. It is not entrapment if you willingly sign the contracts and take the money," I replied coldly. "We gave you the rope, Sylvia. You are the one who decided to tie the noose and kick the chair out from under yourself." I walked over to the large smart television mounted on the wall of the private dining room typically used by corporate clients for dinner presentations. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen a few times. "You wanted to talk about my pathetic little accounting job," I said, not looking back at her as the television screen flickered to life. "You wanted to call me a financial parasite. Well, let me show you exactly what the lead forensic auditor at Apex Private Equity does for a living." The massive screen illuminated the dark room with a bright, harsh white light. A highly complex, terrifyingly detailed financial flowchart appeared, mapping out the entire fraudulent structure of her life. The bright light from the smart screen illuminated the private dining room, casting harsh shadows against the walls. On the screen was a web of red and black lines connecting corporate entities, offshore bank accounts, and redacted tax IDs. At the very center of the web sat Lumiere Aesthetics. It looked less like a business plan and more like a map of a criminal syndicate. I turned to my father. He was staring at the screen, his mouth open, tracking the red lines that spiderwebbed across the display. "I want you to look very closely at this." "Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "You have spent the last 5 years telling anyone who would listen that your wife is a self-made mogul. You allowed her to mock my career because she owned a clinic with a fancy lobby. Now look at the actual foundation of her empire." I tapped my phone and the screen zoomed in on boxes labeled as medical supply vendors. A legitimate business generates revenue by providing a service or selling a product. I explained, pacing toward the table. Lumiere Aesthetics does neither of those things efficiently. For the past 3 years, the clinic has been operating at a massive, unsustainable deficit. The cost of the lease, the imported Italian marble, the custom uniforms, and the state-of-the-art lasers far outweighed the actual income from clients. Sylvia was bleeding money every single month. My father swallowed hard. But she showed me the quarterly reports he protested. The reports showed steady growth. I tapped the screen again. A side-by-side comparison appeared. On the left were the reports Sylvia had shown him, filled with neat ascending green graphs. On the right were the actual bank statements my team had extracted during our audit. "She showed you fabricated spreadsheets," I corrected him. "Those numbers were manufactured to keep you complacent. If you look at the actual ledgers on the right, you will see a series of massive recurring payments made to third-party medical suppliers. Every single month, Lumiere was supposedly purchasing hundreds of thousands of dollars in specialized cosmetic supplies." Richard squinted at the screen. "That makes sense for a clinic, does it not?" "It would make sense," I agreed, "if those suppliers actually existed. But they do not. I ran a forensic trace on every single one of those vendor accounts. They are entirely fictitious dummy corporations registered to a single unmonitored post office box located in the Cayman Islands. Sylvia was creating fake invoices for supplies she never ordered. She would authorize the payments from the Lumiere corporate account, and the money would be wired directly into her own offshore trust." Sylvia let out a loud, strangled sob. She had desperately covered her face with both of her shaking hands, completely unable to look at the glowing screen, unable to look at the absolute, undeniable proof of her guilt displayed for everyone to see. I zoomed in on the most recent transaction. A bold red line connected the Vistara Capital Investment Fund to the Lumiere operating account. The number 15 million was stamped in heavy black ink. "This brings us to this morning." I continued, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "When the Vistara funds cleared the bank at 9 a.m., Sylvia did not allocate that capital to marketing, payroll, or business expansion. Within 45 minutes of the deposit, she initiated a series of wire transfers. She attempted to move $12 million directly into those exact same Cayman Island shell companies, labeling it as a bulk equipment acquisition." My father physically recoiled, sinking deeper into his chair. $12 million, he repeated the number, sounding utterly foreign on his tongue. "That is why I initiated the freeze," I stated firmly. "The moment she tried to move the venture capital money offshore, she triggered a massive fraud alert. My team intercepted the transfers, locked down the accounts, and flagged the entire corporate structure for a federal audit. The money is completely secure, but Sylvia's ability to access a single penny is completely gone." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Sylvia's quiet, pathetic weeping. Richard stared at the screen, the full weight of the deception pressing down on his chest. The woman he had married, the woman he had defended and prioritized over his own flesh and blood, was nothing more than a highly organized thief. "She lied to me," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with a very profound, earth-shattering betrayal. "She lied about everything." I looked at him, feeling a cold, hollow sense of vindication. She did lie about the clinic, Richard, I said softly. But unfortunately for you, the fraud does not stop with her business accounts. It gets more personal. I stepped away from the glowing television screen and walked slowly back to my chair, keeping my eyes fixed on my father. He looked like a man who had just been informed his entire reality was a carefully constructed simulation. You see, Richard Fott explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. Lumiere Aesthetics was never actually meant to be a functioning medical clinic. It was a lifestyle subsidy program disguised as a corporate entity. Sylvia did not want to be a chief executive officer. She just wanted a corporate credit card that she did not have to pay off. I pulled my phone out again and tapped the screen, bringing up a new slide on the television behind me. Let us take a closer look at the operational expenses for the past fiscal year, I said, gesturing to a pie chart that was entirely colored in alarming shades of red. According to the tax returns Sylvia filed, she spent over $400,000 on international medical conferences and continuing education for her staff. But when my forensic team cross-referenced those travel dates with her personal social media accounts, we found something very interesting. I tapped the screen. Side-by-side photos appeared. On the left, a scanned corporate receipt for a week-long dermatology seminar in Paris. On the right, a photo Sylvia had posted on her public profile showing her sipping champagne on a private yacht off the coast of Monaco during that exact same week. Those were not medical conferences, I stated flatly. They were luxury vacations. The corporate catering budget was used to pay for her private chef. The marketing and public relations budget was entirely funneled to high-end personal stylists, luxury car leases, and interior designers who renovated the summer house you rarely even visit. She classified her designer jewelry as office decor. She classified her custom silk gowns as employee uniforms. Sylvia let out a pathetic whimper, burying her face in her arms on the table. She could not formulate a single defense because the evidence was mathematically absolute, but the petty theft of company funds to buy expensive clothes was just the beginning. I continued pacing behind my chair. Sylvia knew the clinic was bleeding out. She knew that eventually the creditors would come knocking. The fake vendor invoices to the Cayman Islands were a slow drip, but she needed a massive cash injection to secure her future before the entire house of cards collapsed. I looked down at the top of Sylvia's perfectly styled hair. That is why she went hunting for venture capital. My father looked utterly devastated. He turned his head slowly, staring at his wife as if she were a complete stranger. "You are going to take the $15 million and run," he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and profound sorrow. "You were going to leave the company bankrupt." "Oh, Richard." I sighed, shaking my head. She was not just going to leave the company bankrupt. She was going to leave you holding the bag. Sylvia flinched violently at my words, but I did not stop. The $15 million from Vistara Capital was her golden parachute, I explained, making sure every word landed with maximum impact. Her plan was incredibly transparent to anyone who knows how to read a financial ledger. She intended to wire $12 million to her offshore accounts this morning, disguised as a bulk equipment purchase. Once the money cleared international waters, it would be virtually impossible to trace or recover. She would then wait a few months, declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy for Lumiere Aesthetics, and claim that the business simply failed due to market conditions. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the back of my chair. "And since you are listed as the primary guarantor on the commercial lease for her luxury clinic, Richard, the creditors would have come directly after you. She would have walked away with millions hidden in the Caribbean, while you would be dragged into federal bankruptcy court to pay off the remaining debts of her failed empire." Richard gasped, clutching his chest, as if he were having a physical reaction to the betrayal. "You were going to destroy me," he whispered, tears finally forming in his eyes. "I gave you everything. I defended you against my own daughter, and you were going to leave me in absolute ruin." Sylvia finally lifted her head, her face a smeared mess of expensive cosmetics and tears. "No, Richard, please," she sobbed, reaching a shaking hand toward him. "It is not what it looks like. I was going to use that money to secure our future. I was doing it for us. I let out a sharp, unforgiving laugh. Do not insult my intelligence, Sylvia, I snapped. Offshore trust accounts do not have joint beneficiaries. That Cayman Island account has exactly one name on it, and it certainly is not yours, Richard. She was securing her own future at the direct expense of your entire legacy. The room fell into a suffocating silence once again. The absolute reality of her parasitic nature had been laid bare under the harsh fluorescent light of the television screen. She had treated the family like a host organism feeding off its resources until she was ready to detach and move on. But as satisfying as it was to expose her business fraud, I was not quite finished. I reached for my phone one last time. Because the venture capital money was not the only thing she stole, I swiped left on my phone screen, and the complex corporate flowchart vanished from the television. In its place, a new set of documents appeared. These were not stamped with the Lumiere corporate logo. They were stamped with the crest of my father's personal wealth management bank. My father looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a new wave of terror. "What is this, Natalie?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Those are my private accounts." "Yes, Richard, they are," I replied calmly, walking back toward my seat. "Or rather, they used to be your accounts. You see, before Sylvia managed to convince Vistara Capital to hand over $15 million, Lumiere Aesthetics was completely hemorrhaging cash. Those private yacht rentals and designer wardrobes were expensive. Her fake medical vendors required a constant stream of capital to keep the shell game moving. She needed a massive bridge loan to keep the illusion alive until the venture capital check cleared. I pointed to a heavily highlighted PDF document on the left side of the screen. Since she had already maxed out her corporate credit lines, I explained she had to look closer to home for the funds. "I want you to look at the date on that document, Richard. 6 months ago. Do you remember what you were doing 6 months ago? You were in Europe on a golfing trip, while your loving wife stayed behind in New York, claiming she had to manage a clinic expansion." Richard nodded slowly, his face completely devoid of color. "Yes, I remember. She was not expanding the clinic," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "While you were playing golf in Scotland, Sylvia drove to your primary financial institution. She presented a comprehensive power of attorney document, a document that gave her absolute unfettered access to your entire financial portfolio. That is impossible," my father choked out, gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "I never signed a power of attorney. I would never give anyone that kind of control." "You did not sign it," I agreed softly. "She forged your signature. She had Jamal draft the legal paperwork, ensuring it looked perfectly legitimate, and then she meticulously forged your signature to bypass the bank security protocols." Sylvia let out a loud gasp, her hands flying to her mouth, but I ignored her completely. "Once she had access to your portfolio, she went straight for the liquid assets." I continued tapping my phone again. A new graph appeared showing a catastrophic downward spiral. In a matter of 4 weeks, she entirely drained your primary retirement fund. She liquidated your municipal bonds. She cashed out the stock options you had been carefully building for the last 20 years. Richard scrambled to pull his own phone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently, he dropped it onto his lap before snatching it up again. He fumbled with his banking app, frantically trying to log in. "But draining your retirement was not enough," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "The lifestyle she wanted was simply too expensive. So she took aim at your most prized possession. The ancestral estate in the Hamptons, the house that has been in our family for 3 generations." My father stopped breathing. He looked up from his phone, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing panic. "No," he whispered. "Not the house. Please tell me she did not touch the house." I pressed a button on my screen and a massive loan agreement flashed onto the television. "She took out a secondary mortgage on the estate," I stated clearly, letting the words sink deep into his bones. "And when she burned through that money, she took out a third. The ancestral home is currently leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. She pulled over $4 million in equity out of the property and funneled every single cent of it directly into the Lumiere accounts to keep the lights on and pay for her designer lifestyle. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard finally managed to log into his banking app. I watched his face as the screen loaded. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the numbers staring back at him. The millions of dollars he thought he had carefully preserved for his golden years were entirely gone, replaced by a staggering wall of debt. He let his phone slip from his fingers. It clattered loudly against his porcelain dinner plate. He looked at Sylvia. He did not yell. He did not scream. He just stared at her with a look of complete, irreversible devastation. She had not just stolen his money. She had stolen his family legacy, his security, and his future. She had stripped him down to absolutely nothing. "You ruined me," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of a broken man. "I have nothing left." Sylvia tried to reach for him, tears streaming down her face. "Richard, please, I can explain. We can fix this. Do not touch me," he roared, his voice finally exploding with raw, unadulterated fury. He violently shoved her hand away. "You stole my life. You forged my name and you stole my life." I stood quietly at the end of the table, watching the empire he had chosen over me burn completely to the ground. He had finally learned the true cost of his arrogance. My father did not look away from the small digital screen resting on his porcelain plate. He picked the phone back up, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely keep it steady. He tapped furiously, navigating from one account to another, praying to find a hidden reserve, a glitch, a single remaining dollar that had survived her rampage. But there was nothing. His primary checking account was overdrawn. His high-yield savings account, which he had bragged about at my college graduation while refusing to help me pay tuition, was completely zeroed out. The investment portfolio that had taken him 4 decades of relentless cutthroat corporate maneuvering to build had been completely liquidated. 0. The numbers stared back at him from every single tab. He was 62 years old, accustomed to a life of bespoke suits, private clubs, and unquestioned authority. Now his net worth was not just 0. With the massive secondary and tertiary mortgages she had secretly taken out on the ancestral estate, his net worth was deeply, irrecoverably negative. The realization hit him with the physical force of a heart attack. Richard dropped the phone again. It slid across the table and bumped into the silver breadbasket. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Sylvia," he choked out, his voice sounding entirely hollow, stripped of the booming patriarchal authority he had wielded just an hour prior. "Why would you do this? I gave you the black credit cards. I bought you the cars. I bought you the jewelry. Why did you have to take the house? Why did you have to take my retirement?" Sylvia completely collapsed. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer persona she had been projecting all evening shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She slid out of her chair and fell to her knees on the cold marble floor, the luxurious silk of her custom gown pooling around her. She reached up and grabbed the lapels of my father's expensive jacket, tears ruining her perfectly applied designer makeup. "I had to do it, Richard," she sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing shrilly in the private dining room. "You do not understand the pressure. You do not understand what it takes to survive in this city." Every time we went to the country club, those women looked at me like I was nothing. They judged my clothes. They judged my car. I had to maintain our image. I had to show them that we belonged at the absolute top of the social ladder. She buried her face against his chest, her shoulders shaking violently. "The clinic was supposed to make us billionaires, Richard. I just needed a little more time. I was going to pay it all back. The venture capital money was going to fix everything. I was doing it for our status. I was doing it for you." My father looked down at the weeping woman clinging to his jacket. The sheer absurdity of her excuse seemed to finally snap something inside his brain. He grabbed her wrists and forcefully pried her hands off his suit, pushing her away with a sudden, violent surge of disgust. For my status, he roared, the sound tearing out of his throat like a wounded animal. "You stole my ancestral home to buy imported marble and fake medical supplies so you could impress a bunch of country club wives who do not even like you. You committed federal fraud to buy designer clothes. You did not do this for my image, Sylvia. You did this because you are a greedy, shallow parasite. Sylvia recoiled, curling into a ball on the floor, weeping loudly into her hands. Please, she wailed, her voice thick with desperation. Please do not leave me. We can declare bankruptcy. We can downsize. We can start over. Start over, Richard repeated, letting out a dark, breathless laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. I am 62 years old. I have no money. I have no house. My own son-in-law just ran out that door to avoid being dragged into federal prison with you. There is no starting over for a man my age. I am completely ruined. He slumped forward, resting his head on his arms on the mahogany table. The great patriarch of the family, the man who had allowed his wife and his golden child to mock me for 34 years, was reduced to a weeping, broken shell. He had traded his loyal daughter for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an automated teller machine. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of his own terrible choices play out in real time. He had built his entire life around the shallow illusion of wealth and status, completely ignoring the rot festering at the foundation. Now the foundation had completely given way, and the house had collapsed directly on top of him. I walked back to my chair, my steps slow and deliberate, and picked up my leather bag. There was still one final piece of business to handle before I closed this chapter of my life forever. I reached my hand into the depths of my leather bag, my fingers brushing past my wallet until they found the smooth, slightly textured paper of the plain white envelope. It was the exact same envelope I had placed on the table 2 hours ago. The one Sylvia had violently shoved back at me. The one she had mocked as a pathetic handmade arts and crafts project from a broke accountant. The one my father had sighed at, calling me an embarrassment to the family image. I pulled the envelope out and held it up under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier. The room was deathly quiet. Sylvia was still kneeling on the floor, her face buried in her hands, while my father stared blankly at the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by his newly acquired poverty. Richard I said, my voice sharp enough to snap his attention back to me. Look at this. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at the white envelope, confusion briefly flashing across his devastated features. He did not understand why I was bringing up a cheap birthday card in the middle of his financial apocalypse. When my forensic team first uncovered the massive fraudulent loan Sylvia took out against the ancestral estate, I had a choice to make. I explained, keeping my tone conversational but commanding. As a senior partner at Apex Private Equity, my initial instinct was to simply let the bank foreclose on the property. It was a terrible investment, poisoned by forgery and greed. But then I remembered the summers I spent in that house as a child. I remembered the library where I used to read, hiding away from you and your new wife. I remembered that it was the last remaining piece of actual tangible legacy this family had left. I opened the flap of the envelope and slid my fingers inside. So despite the decades of neglect, despite the fact that you consistently chose Madeline over me, I decided to do something incredibly foolish. I continued. I decided to be a good daughter. I used my own personal capital to buy out the toxic debt. I contacted the lending institutions, negotiated the early payoff penalties, and wired over $4 million of my own money to clear the secondary and tertiary mortgages Sylvia had secretly secured. My father stopped breathing. He stared at my hands as I pulled a thick, tightly folded stack of legal documents out of the envelope. The heavy parchment paper crackled loudly in the quiet room. I unfolded the documents and laid them flat on the table right next to his shattered crystal wineglass. At the very top, stamped with the official gold seal of the county clerk, were the words, "Satisfaction of mortgage." Right beneath it was the original deed to the Hampton estate, fully unencumbered, transferred completely free and clear. "This was my birthday gift to you, Richard," I said softly, looking directly into his eyes. "I brought this here tonight to hand you back your freedom. I was going to give you the deed, explain what your wife had done, and offer you a fresh start. I was going to save you." Richard let out a ragged, desperate gasp. He lunged forward in his chair. both of his hands reaching out frantically toward the heavy parchment paper. A massive, overwhelming wave of relief washed over his face. The crushing weight of bankruptcy and total ruin suddenly lifted, replaced by the miraculous salvation provided by the daughter he had spent 34 years ignoring. Natalie. Oh my God, Natalie. He wept, his fingers trembling as they hovered just inches above the documents. You saved the house. You saved me. I am so sorry I ever doubted you. I am so sorry for everything. Thank you. Thank you so much. Just as his fingertips brushed the edge of the deed, I calmly reached out and pulled the documents away from him. His hands grasped at empty air. He looked up at me, a sudden spike of panic piercing through his tearful relief. Natalie, what are you doing? He asked, his voice cracking. I looked down at the man who had allowed his wife to publicly humiliate me over a dinner bill just an hour ago. I looked at the man who had called my wardrobe a disgrace and told me to get a real job. I brought this here to save you, Richard. I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. But then I sat at this table. I listened to you enable her cruelty. I watched you nod in agreement as she called me a parasite. I heard you demand that I pay a $20,000 bill to prove my worth to a family that has never valued me for a single second. I gripped the top edge of the thick parchment paper with both hands. A gift of this magnitude requires a recipient who is actually worthy of it, I stated coldly. And tonight, you proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that you deserve absolutely nothing from me. No, Richard screamed, throwing himself forward, his chest hitting the edge of the table. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I ripped the official deed right down the middle. The sound of the heavy paper tearing echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Sylvia screamed from the floor. Richard reached out, grasping frantically at my wrists, but I easily stepped back, pulling the documents out of his reach. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, destroying the gold seal of the county clerk. I tore the satisfaction of mortgage. I tore the transfer papers. I kept tearing until the multi-million-dollar salvation was nothing more than a handful of jagged, worthless confetti. I opened my hands and let the pieces flutter down onto the pristine white tablecloth. They landed softly on top of his empty dinner plate, a brutal reminder of the wealth he had just lost forever. I opened my hands and let the pieces flutter down onto the pristine white tablecloth. They landed softly on top of his empty dinner plate, a brutal reminder of the wealth he had just lost forever. Richard stared at the pieces of torn parchment as if they were his own severed limbs. His breathing was shallow, his eyes glassy and unblinking. The reality of his absolute ruin had finally settled into his bones, rendering him entirely speechless. Sylvia, however, was still desperately searching for a loophole. She wiped her smeared makeup with the back of her trembling hand and looked up at me from the floor. She was a woman who had spent her entire life manipulating the system, and her brain refused to accept that she had been completely outplayed. "You cannot do this!" Sylvia choked out, her voice raw and grating. "You cannot just tear up a legal document and pretend you own everything. I still have rights. My company is still a registered corporate entity. Even if the bank accounts are frozen, I still own the physical assets. I can sell the clinic equipment. I can sell my car. I can hire a lawyer who is not Jamal and fight you in court." I looked down at her, marveling at the sheer depth of her ignorance. I had just dismantled her entire life piece by piece, and she still thought she had leverage. "You really did not read the Vistara Capital investment contract, did you, Sylvia?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. "I told you my firm specializes in hostile acquisitions. We do not hand out $15 million without securing massive collateral." She stopped crying, her eyes widening in sudden fresh terror. "What collateral?" she whispered. I turned back to the television screen and tapped my phone one more time. The screen flashed, displaying the final page of the contract she had eagerly signed just 3 days ago. I highlighted a specific paragraph in bright yellow. Section 4, paragraph 12. I read aloud, making sure my father heard every single word. In the event of a breach of contract including, but not limited to the unauthorized transfer of funds to offshore holding accounts, the investor retains the immediate and irrevocable right to seize all corporate and personal assets listed by the guarantor. Sylvia scrambled to her feet, leaning heavily against the table. But I did not list any personal assets, she protested wildly. I only listed the clinic. You listed Lumiere Aesthetics as the primary corporate guarantor? I corrected her smoothly. But because you were commingling your personal finances with your business accounts, because you bought your designer wardrobe and your luxury vehicles using the company credit line, those items are legally classified as corporate assets. And because you defaulted on the contract the exact second you tried to wire that money to the Cayman Islands this morning, Apex Private Equity immediately executed the foreclosure clause. I stepped closer to her, my eyes locking onto the heavy diamond ring sparkling on her finger. I own your clinic, Sylvia, I stated flatly. My team changed the locks on the doors an hour ago. We seized the imported Italian marble lobby, the state-of-the-art laser machines you leased, and the patient database. I own the custom silk gown you are currently wearing, which you bought with stolen company funds last week. She looked down at her dress in sheer horror, as if it had suddenly caught fire. I own your expensive designer handbags, I continued, my voice relentless. I own your diamond bracelets, and I own the white Bentley currently parked with the valet outside this restaurant. The title was transferred to Apex Private Equity at exactly 4:00 this afternoon. No, Sylvia screamed, grabbing her hair with both hands. You cannot take my car. How am I supposed to get home? You do not have a home, Sylvia, I reminded her coldly. My father is about to lose the ancestral estate because you forged his signature and maxed out the equity. The bank will seize that property within the month. You have absolutely nothing left. You are bankrupt, homeless, and entirely at the mercy of the federal authorities. My father finally looked up from his plate of torn paper. He looked at Sylvia, the woman he had chosen to replace my mother, the woman he had allowed to push me out of my own family. He saw her for exactly what she was, a pathetic, empty shell who had traded his legacy for a few years of fake high society status. Give it to her? Richard said, his voice entirely dead. Sylvia looked at him confused. What? Give Natalie the jewelry, Richard ordered, his voice rising, slightly filled with a bitter, vindictive edge. Give her the keys to the car. Take off the bracelets. Do exactly what she says. You ruined us, Sylvia. It is completely over. Sylvia looked around the room, realizing she was entirely trapped. There were no lawyers to save her. There were no golden children to defend her. There was only a broken old man and the stepdaughter she had foolishly underestimated. Slowly, with shaking hands, she reached for the clasp of her diamond bracelet. The heavy platinum mechanism clicked open and the jewelry slipped from her wrist, hitting the mahogany table with a sharp, heavy thud. She reached behind her neck, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely undo the latch of her diamond pendant. It joined the bracelet on the table. Finally, she dug into her designer clutch and pulled out the heavy leather-bound key fob for the white Bentley. She pushed it across the white linen, her head bowed in absolute humiliating defeat. I reached out and scooped the items into my hand. The diamonds felt cold against my skin. I dropped them into the hidden compartment of my bag right next to the black Centurion card that had started this entire cascade of destruction. I zipped the compartment shut, sealing away the last remnants of her fabricated empire. Sylvia curled back up on the floor, weeping silently, utterly broken. But my attention was no longer on her. I turned my gaze back to my father. Richard was staring at me. The anger that had briefly flared up when he yelled at Sylvia had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, suffocating desperation. He was a drowning man, and the water was rising rapidly over his head. He looked at my designer bag, then at my calm, unbothered face. He suddenly realized that the woman standing in front of him was not the scapegoat daughter he could easily dismiss. She was a Wall Street titan, holding the absolute power of life and death over his financial future. He slowly pushed himself up from his chair. His legs were shaking so badly he had to lean heavily against the table to keep from collapsing. He reached his hand out across the ruined table, his palm facing upward in a pathetic gesture of supplication. "Natalie," he said, his voice cracking into a desperate, agonizing sob. "Natalie, please, you have to help me." I stood perfectly still. I did not reach out to take his hand. I just watched him. "I am so sorry," he wept, the tears flowing freely down his aged, wrinkled face. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything. For the last 30 years. I was blinded by her. I was stupid. I wanted the perfect family image so badly that I completely ignored the only person who actually cared about me. I let her treat you terribly. I let Madeline mock you. I was a terrible father, Natalie. I admit it. I am begging for your forgiveness." He took a ragged breath, his chest heaving. The great patriarch was completely stripping away his pride, laying himself bare in the middle of a luxury restaurant. "But you can fix this," Richard pleaded, his voice rising in frantic urgency. "You just said your firm manages billions of dollars. 4 million is absolutely nothing to you. You can issue a new payoff for the mortgages. You can save the ancestral estate. You can save me from federal bankruptcy court. Please, Natalie, I am your father. You cannot just leave me here with nothing. You cannot let me die penniless. Give me a loan. I will pay you back. I will do whatever you want." I listened to his desperate rambling pleas. I listened to the apologies that I had spent my entire childhood praying to hear. I remembered being 18 years old, standing in his home office begging him to co-sign my student loans so I could go to college. I remembered him looking at me with cold indifference, telling me that he needed the capital for Madeline's new equestrian lessons and that I would just have to figure it out on my own. I remembered the countless holidays where I was seated at the edge of the table, ignored and belittled, while he showered his new wife and his golden child with lavish gifts and unconditional praise. He did not love me. He only loved what I could do for him. He was only apologizing now because the bank was coming for his house and his fraudulent wife was headed to prison. I looked down at the torn pieces of the deed resting on his dinner plate. The salvation he had literally held in his hands just minutes ago. I slipped the strap of my leather bag over my shoulder and buttoned the front of my tailored blazer. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy, any anger, or any lingering affection. "Stop making a scene, Richard," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing his exact words from the beginning of the evening. "You are embarrassing the family." Richard froze. The air completely left his lungs. He stared at me, his mouth open in a silent scream of absolute despair, recognizing the exact phrase he had used to dismiss me just 2 hours ago. The realization that I was entirely immune to his tears, that there would be no bailout and no forgiveness, finally broke him completely. He slumped back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. I stood there in the quiet elegance of the private dining room, watching the great patriarch of our family reduced to a weeping shell. His broad shoulders shook with every sob, the sound pathetic and hollow against the backdrop of the mahogany walls and crystal chandeliers. Sylvia remained curled on the floor, stripped of her diamonds, and her dignity staring blankly at the torn pieces of paper on the table. The air in the room felt incredibly still, almost suffocating, as the reality of their absolute ruin settled over them. But the stillness was about to be broken. Through the thick, frosted glass windows of the private dining area that faced the busy Manhattan street, a sudden shift in the lighting caught my eye. The warm yellow glow of the street lamps was abruptly overpowered by sharp, rhythmic flashes of intense blue and red. The vibrant colors pierced through the frosted glass, dancing violently across the crisp white tablecloth and reflecting off the shattered pieces of Sylvia's crystal champagne flute on the marble floor. Richard stopped sobbing. He slowly lowered his hands from his face, his bloodshot eyes catching the flashing lights. He looked toward the window, his expression shifting from profound despair to utter confusion. Sylvia noticed it too. The rhythmic flashing painted her pale, tear-streaked face in alternating shades of crimson and blue. Her breath hitched in her throat, her survival instinct battered and broken as it was flared up one final time. She scrambled backward on the floor, pressing her back against the dark wood paneling of the wall, her eyes wide with a new terrifying realization. "What is that?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling as he looked from the window to me. "Natalie, what did you do?" I turned away from the window and looked down at them, adjusting the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder. "I told you both earlier that I am the lead forensic auditor for Apex Private Equity," I began, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. But what Jamal failed to realize during his arrogant little legal lecture is that my position carries significant federal obligations. I do not just manage money, Richard. I hold a highly specialized license granted by the federal government. Sylvia covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, high-pitched whimper as the wail of a police siren briefly echoed from the street below before being abruptly cut off. "When you hold a license like mine," I continued, pacing slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors, "you are legally bound by strict reporting protocols. When I uncover concrete, irrefutable evidence of massive corporate fraud, I do not have the luxury of keeping it a family secret. If I had simply frozen the accounts and walked away, I would have been guilty of aiding and abetting a financial crime. I would have lost my license, my partnership, and my freedom." Richard's jaw dropped. "You called the police?" he choked out, staring at his wife in horror. "I did not just call the local precinct." "Richard," I corrected him smoothly. "Local police do not handle multi-million-dollar corporate money laundering operations." The moment Sylvia attempted to wire $12 million to a Cayman Islands shell company this morning, it triggered an automatic suspicious activity report within the federal banking system. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the room. "All I had to do was package the evidence," I said softly. "I compiled the forged loan documents for the ancestral estate, the fake medical vendor invoices, the offshore trust account details, and the fraudulent tax returns Sylvia filed for the last 3 years. I placed all of that undeniable proof onto a secure encrypted drive and sent it directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And just to be incredibly thorough, I copied the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." Sylvia let out a blood-curdling scream. She threw her hands over her ears as if she could physically block out the words I was saying. "No!" she shrieked, thrashing against the wall. "Not the IRS. They will take everything. I did not mean to. I will pay it back. The Internal Revenue Service does not accept apologies for tax evasion and wire fraud, Sylvia," I reminded her coldly. "You siphoned millions of dollars into offshore accounts and failed to report a single cent of it as income. The federal government takes that very personally." Outside the private dining room, the soft jazz music of the restaurant was suddenly cut off. The low murmur of wealthy patrons was abruptly replaced by the sound of authoritative voices. I could hear the restaurant manager stammering, trying to maintain order. Then came the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps marching across the marble lobby. They were not walking slowly. They were moving with the aggressive, undeniable purpose of federal agents executing a high-level arrest warrant. Richard sat completely paralyzed, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, waiting for the inevitable. The empire of lies he had built and defended was about to be violently dismantled. "They are here," I announced quietly, turning my back on my father and his fraudulent wife. The trap had fully closed. The heavy mahogany doors burst open. Not a gentle push from a polite waiter, but a forceful, authoritative entry that sent the heavy wood crashing violently against the brass doorstops. The terrified restaurant manager stumbled backward into the room, quickly stepping aside and pressing his back against the wall to make way for the men and women crowding the threshold. 5 agents stepped into the private dining room. They were dressed in dark, unassuming suits, but the bold yellow letters printed across the backs of their navy blue windbreakers left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. FBI, IRS, Criminal Investigation Division. They moved with striking tactical efficiency, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the room and blocking the only exit. Sylvia, the lead agent, announced, his voice a deep resonant baritone that commanded instant and absolute obedience. He did not phrase it as a question. He already held a thick manila folder in his left hand, and his right hand rested casually near his utility belt. Sylvia pressed herself harder against the dark wood paneling of the wall, looking exactly like a trapped animal facing a predator. She opened her mouth to speak, to lie, to manipulate her way out of the corner, as she had always done, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped her throat. Sylvia, the agent, repeated, stepping closer to her with heavy, deliberate footsteps. "I am Special Agent Davis with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing a federal arrest warrant for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately." The sharp, uncompromising command finally shattered the paralyzing shock holding her in place. Sylvia let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that vibrated the crystal glasses on the table. "No!" she screamed, dropping to her knees and scrambling awkwardly across the hard marble floor toward the dining table. She grabbed the edge of the pristine white linen tablecloth, her knuckles turning bone white as she hauled herself up. "Richard, tell them. Tell them it is a massive mistake. Richard, do something right now. Call a lawyer. Call Jamal. We have money. Tell them we can fix this." Richard did not move a single muscle. He did not turn his head. He did not look at the woman he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. He remained seated in his chair, his shoulders slumped forward, his eyes entirely vacant. He was staring blankly at his empty porcelain dinner plate, fixated completely on the jagged, torn pieces of the satisfaction of mortgage that I had ripped up just moments ago. The multi-million-dollar salvation that he had arrogantly thrown away to appease the very woman now begging him for salvation. Two agents closed the distance instantly. They reached down, gripping Sylvia tightly by the upper arms, and hauled her to her feet with practiced, unrelenting force. She thrashed wildly, her expensive custom silk gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face in a tangled, sweaty mess, completely ruining her carefully crafted high society image. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the crystal chandeliers above us. "You cannot do this to me. I am a chief executive officer. I own a luxury clinic. I have institutional investors. Richard, please help me." "Ma'am, stop resisting right now," the second agent warned sharply, easily, overpowering her frantic struggles. He spun her around and pinned her arms firmly behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent dining room. It was a crisp, definitive sound that completely severed her from the life of luxury and privilege she had maliciously stolen. "You have the right to remain silent." Special Agent Davis began reciting, his authoritative voice cutting cleanly through her hysterical, pathetic sobbing. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." They began marching her aggressively toward the open door. Sylvia twisted her neck desperately, looking back at the mahogany table one last time. Her eyes darted past her broken husband and locked directly onto me. "Natalie," she wailed, her eyes filled with a frantic, pathetic desperation that I had never seen before. "Natalie, tell them to stop. You have your money back. Just take the clinic. Take the cars. Take it all. Tell them to let me go." "I am so sorry." I stood perfectly still, my expression entirely impassive and cold. "I am afraid that is entirely out of my hands now, Sylvia," I replied, my voice echoing clearly in the chaotic room. "The federal government does not negotiate with thieves." The agents pulled her out into the brightly lit hallway. I could hear her screams echoing loudly through the main dining room as they dragged her past the tables of Manhattan elite. The wealthy patrons, the exact high-value individuals she had spent years desperately trying to impress, were now watching her get hauled away in federal handcuffs. Her reputation, her business empire, and her freedom were completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut abruptly, cutting off the sound of her wails. The sudden silence in the private dining room was incredibly heavy. The vibrant energy, the arrogance, and the chaos had all been violently extracted, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of a completely destroyed family. I looked at my father. Richard was completely alone. His golden child daughter had fled to save herself. His arrogant lawyer son-in-law had abandoned him without a second thought. His fraudulent wife was currently on her way to a federal holding cell, and his ancestral home was destined for immediate foreclosure. He reached out with a trembling, aged hand and picked up a single torn piece of the deed. He traced the ripped edge with his thumb, a single tear rolling down his cheek and splashing onto the white tablecloth. He had absolutely nothing left. I adjusted the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder and took a deep cleansing breath. It was finally time for me to go. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my designer shoes echoing against the marble floor, completely drowning out the pathetic, broken weeping of the man I used to call my father. I did not look back. There was absolutely nothing left in that room for me anyway. Just a shattered illusion, a pile of torn parchment paper, and a man who finally had to live with the devastating consequences of his own superficial vanity. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped out into the brightly lit hallway. The restaurant manager and the head sommelier were standing just a few feet away. They both looked incredibly pale, their eyes wide with shock, utterly shell-shocked by the aggressive federal raid they had just witnessed. The manager immediately stiffened his posture as I approached, clearly terrified that I might turn my corporate wrath onto his establishment next. I stopped right in front of him. I unzipped the small hidden compartment of my bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp $100 bills. I had withdrawn the cash specifically for this evening, fully anticipating that my family would cause a massive scene. I handed the stack directly to the sommelier, who took it with trembling hands. "There is $5,000 there," I said smoothly, my voice calm and perfectly polite. "Please divide it evenly among the waitstaff who had to endure my family tonight. I sincerely apologize for the disruption to your dining room. I assure you they will never be returning to this establishment." The sommelier stared at the massive stack of cash, completely speechless, before bowing his head in deep, profound respect. I walked past him, stepping out into the main dining room. The entire restaurant was dead silent. The elite socialites, the powerful hedge fund managers, and the old money matriarchs of Manhattan had all stopped eating. Their expensive forks were suspended in mid-air. They were all staring directly at me. They had seen Jamal run out in a frantic panic. They had watched Sylvia get dragged out in federal handcuffs, screaming like a lunatic. And now they saw me, the supposedly broke, unremarkable daughter, walking out with my head held high, completely unbothered by the absolute destruction I had just orchestrated. I did not shrink under their intense gaze. I met their eyes with a cold, absolute confidence, my posture perfectly straight. I pushed through the heavy glass front doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp Manhattan air. The flashing blue and red lights were already fading into the distance as the federal convoy transported Sylvia downtown to a holding cell. The street was calm again. The valet rushed forward, but I simply raised a hand to stop him. A massive jet-black, heavily armored SUV smoothly pulled up to the curb right in front of me. The driver, a towering security specialist named Thomas, immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather seat. Thomas closed the door with a solid, comforting thud that completely sealed off the noise of the city. He got behind the wheel and smoothly merged into the heavy New York traffic. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes, letting out a long exhale. The physical and emotional weight of the past 34 years felt as though it had completely evaporated from my shoulders. For my entire life, I had allowed those toxic people to make me feel small. I had allowed them to dictate my worth based on their shallow standards. I had wasted so much time waiting for an apology or a scrap of validation that was never going to come. But I finally understood the absolute truth. You cannot reason with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot prove your value to people who actively benefit from making you feel worthless. The greatest revenge is not screaming at the dinner table. It is not throwing a temper tantrum or begging for them to see your side of the story. The greatest revenge is massive silent success. While they spent years building a fragile illusion of wealth, buying designer clothes they could not afford, just to impress people who did not care about them, I was quietly building an actual empire. I let them underestimate me because their arrogance was the exact tactical blind spot I needed to orchestrate their downfall. I did not have to raise my voice to destroy Sylvia. I only had to raise my net worth. I did not have to argue with Jamal about his legal prowess. I only had to buy his law firm. True power is perfectly quiet. As Thomas drove me back toward my penthouse overlooking Central Park, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. I had walked into that restaurant as the forgotten scapegoat. But I was driving away as the sole architect of my own absolute freedom. Have you ever had to use your silent success to destroy the people who thought you were nothing? Share your story below. Like and subscribe for more. The story of Natalie teaches a profound and difficult lesson. We cannot force toxic people to see our worth, but we can quietly build a life where their opinions no longer matter. For years, Natalie endured the cruelty of a father who valued status over his daughter, a stepmother who mocked her, and a brother-in-law who constantly belittled her career. Her natural instinct might have been to argue or to desperately prove her value. Instead, she chose the path of silent success. This narrative perfectly illustrates the absolute futility of seeking validation from those who are determined to misunderstand you. When an environment is built on superficial appearances and the need for a scapegoat, no amount of logic, kindness, or pleading will change their minds. Natalie recognized this reality and stopped trying to win a rigged game. She focused her energy entirely on her own professional and personal growth, building a massive empire in the shadows, while her family constructed a fragile house of cards out of lies, vanity, and crippling debt. When the inevitable collision occurred, Natalie did not need to raise her voice or throw a tantrum. The undeniable reality of her success spoke for her, effectively shattering their illusions without a single shout. Her journey reminds us that our true value is never determined by the limitations, cruelty, or blindness of the people around us. We do not have to set ourselves on fire to keep others warm. True power is found in walking away from toxic tables and building your own. It is knowing your worth internally so you never have to beg for it externally. Instead of arguing, just focus completely on your personal elevation. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you are ready to leave toxic environments behind.